Okay, good morning. In this research brief, so it's not that I'm talking for another hour, it's just a 15-minute presentation. I'm going to be describing an exploratory study that I did on myself in March of this year that sought to investigate how exposure to a Mandelbrot zoom compared to a control condition in terms of performance at a clairvoyance study. So I discussed a fractal lens for psi phenomena yesterday, but I'm going to briefly revisit some definitions for psi phenomena and why they're potentially intriguing for the psi question before I go ahead and explain and tell you about what we found. So, what are fractals? Hopefully you know what fractals are a little bit after yesterday. So, fractals as a concept were born in 1975 by Benoit Mandelbrot. And he applied the Latin term for broken to these recurring similar patterns that he noticed in nature and everywhere. And these patterns occur at different scales and they echo one another. So they're mathematical patterns that exhibit these recurring self-similar properties, and they repeat at various scales of magnitude, but also across time. And I mentioned this yesterday in terms of its relevance to psi. So it seems to be a signature of living and natural phenomena. And I mentioned yesterday about several examples in nature, so I've got some pictures on the slide that demonstrate that fractals really do appear quite a lot in various areas of nature, including coastlines and plants and trees. And I mentioned as well that it's also apparent in the human body, in the respiratory system, the cardiovascular system, and nervous system, etc. And I also mentioned that this is something that we see in terms of behaviours and experiences as well. So Marks-Tarlow has called fractals an archetypal meta-pattern that you see in various areas of the natural world, which I think is really fascinating. And again, I want to encourage everybody to go ahead and read that book if you can get hold of it. It's very expensive, but A Fractal Epistemology for a Scientific Psychology is extremely convincing that fractals are interesting for anything that's relevant to consciousness studies. So in terms of the human and animal behaviours and experiences, particularly relevant to parapsychologists is the observation that we see fractal signatures in creative outputs. We see fractals as being particularly enticing and grabbing our attention. And we see fractals emerging particularly in certain states of consciousness, particularly meditation and REM sleep in comparison to non-REM sleep. But also the study by Varley et al. Found that there were fractal signatures emerging in terms of actual emergence of consciousness as well. So it's, I think, quite interesting for these questions of consciousness. Again, this is something I talked about in more detail yesterday, but I think that fractals have a lot to tell us about psi. We have this shared liminal nature of fractals and psi phenomena. Fractals may allow for the fuzzy boundaries between people and allow for information transfer across various boundaries, including across space and time, as indicated in a lot of psi phenomena. So systems, including states of consciousness that are rich in fractals, tend to be healthy systems. I noted this yesterday as well. And these have connections that echo at these different levels of magnitude and across time. And it may be that these self-similar attributes are interesting for psi, and they resonate with one another, and potentially allow for information to be available within the system. And this is even within the self system, because the study I'm going to talk about is a psi study on myself. So the system is me and the targets. So Marks-Tarlow and Shapiro wrote another paper in 21 and suggested that a fractal epistemology allows for this access to a larger non-local reality within subjective space. So their work was particularly focusing on interpersonal related experiences. But they talked about psychic knowing, and I think this does apply also to psi experiences within the self and between a person and target information as well. So just a brief word on the Mandelbrot zoom. Hopefully I can show you one when I get to talk to you about the experiment, but I know that sometimes technology doesn't play. So this is a still version of a Mandelbrot zoom, and I just grabbed this definition from the Encyclopedia Britannica. in terms of the Mandelbrot set. So it's a set of numbers that displays fractal properties. And it's not smooth, and it has regions of the set that look like smaller scale copies of the whole set. So when we talk about the zoom is a representation of this mathematical set of numbers, and you basically see the fractal moving, and you're moving with it. So this is why I think it's interesting for Psi as well. The zoom represents an animation of the movement, I suppose, down the fractal scales. So you're sort of moving with it, and it evokes a sense of the infinite. And it's actually quite an interesting subjective experience to watch it. So hopefully it'll work when I get to the experiment, but if it doesn't, I can send you the link, and there's lots of them on YouTube as well, so you can go ahead and just look at one. It's quite fun. So this is something that I did after getting obsessed with fractals, and decided to run a little pilot study on myself in the first instance. And I think it's something that I definitely want to do again with more people. So it's an N of 1, me, and it's sought to explore how exposure to fractal imagery, a Mandelbrot zoom, compared to watching a blank screen in terms of performance at a web-based clairvoyance task. And so I hypothesized that the sum of ranks would be significant for both conditions, but perhaps stronger in the fractal condition. And then I also was planning to look at the hits versus misses in terms of fractals compared to control, using a cross-tabulation and chi-square. So again, this is really a pilot study. But I managed to do quite a few sessions. So anyway, here's my conditions. I don't know if it's actually going to work, but we'll see if we can make it work. I found a fractal zoom on YouTube that's, I think, 1 minute and 45 seconds long, and I created a blank control version where I just had a PowerPoint black screen and filmed it for 1 minute and 45 seconds as my controls. They're matched in terms of time. I don't know if this is going to work, but we'll see. Okay, so this is the one I used. There's lots out there. I think it's cool. And it's a very short induction as well. If we're thinking about Psi experiments that are more time efficient, because the Ganzfeld is wonderful, but the induction procedure can take a little bit of time, particularly when you're putting people at ease. And so this is quite short, but quite beautiful, I think. So you're sort of moving down the scales of magnitude with the Mandelbrot zoom. I'm actually feeling quite dizzy just watching it. And it should stop after 1 minute and 45 seconds. At which point I'll need Jake's assistance. It's nearly there. Okay. Okay. So now you know what I'm talking about with my zoom going here. So yeah, I already showed the blank condition. It's basically just, oh no, okay, time flies. The other condition is just a blank screen that was filmed for the same period of time, but you get the sense for what the experiment was. So for the way I did this was I randomly determined the trial order. 1 was control, I think, and 2 was Mandelbrot zoom. And I organized it so that I would do sessions. I'd do 5 sessions on experimental days, and experimental days were days that I wasn't teaching, because I wanted to be able to be at home and in the same location and be relaxed and not have any distractions. And so it was run in March of this year, and so I did some pilot work before I started to see how feasible it was to run more than 1 session, and it worked really, really well. So each trial was watching the induction and then going to Mike Daniels' Clairvoyance trial, which I decided to use because I didn't want to have any awareness of what the target sets might be, and I wanted to use an existing Psi task. And so this is a free response task that you can set up as Clairvoyance, and you can also set it to have different amounts of time for the sending period. So I set it for 1 minute. So it's a very, very short trial period. So yeah, it started with a 1 minute trial, 1 minute sending period. And during that time, I would just close my eyes and just observe anything that was happening in terms of imagery. And I wrote down my impressions. And then you press a button on the experiment and you see the 4 possibilities. It's a free response task. And you present ranks for which you think the target is, from 1 down to 4. So then I would write down my choice and I'd enter it into the system as well. And then I would write down why I picked that particular target. And then I put down in a Google Doc what the actual target was. So I was collecting the rank score that I gave to the target. And so I've got all of that in a Google Doc. It's not perfect, but it's a pilot study just to sort of really investigate. And it was very fun. I know I'm getting really low on time, but here's my results, which I think are cool. And you can tell, even just by eyeballing the data, that the fractal condition is interesting. We have a lower sum of ranks score overall in the fractal condition compared to the control condition. And I picked sum of ranks because I think that there is evidence that psi is more like a graded thing rather than an all or nothing phenomenon. And if you just look at first place hits, you can see already that, there's a slightly higher hit rate for the control condition if you're looking just at hits versus misses. But sum of ranks, you really do see that there is some interesting patterns going on in terms of the fractal compared to the non-fractal condition. And so that isn't significant, but it's interesting. And so I definitely would like to do more with this because I think something might be going on here. So that's my very quick results. I'm probably really low on time. There's my frequency analysis, which is not significant because there's nothing about hits versus misses. And just because I think it was interesting, I really enjoyed it. I found the imagery to be fascinating. And that, it's not a long induction, but I found imagery to come quite quickly to me. And I just wanted to share a few of the hits that I thought were interesting. And I found it quite playful as well. I found myself in an interesting state of play. And particularly the wood one was just cool. Because I saw the target set and I was like, okay, if this is not the target, then psi does not occur. And then the target was wood. So I'm like, okay, this is interesting. So just to show you what some of my more impressive hits were. But yeah, it's just a pilot study. I just wanted to share it with you because I talked yesterday about fractals. So I think fractals are promising, perhaps, for parapsychology. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks, Christine. So we have 5 minutes for questions now.
Thank you. That's really cool. The question is about the participant.
Yeah.
And how many psi traits do you have regularly? Because just to be a devil's advocate here, if you, are psychic and the control had, you were intuiting what the target was, maybe the Mandelbrot zoom possibly distracted you, so you might have more psi traits than the next person. I'm just wondering, are you prone to those kind of experiences?
No, not really. I mean, I don't think I'm not psychic. I think everything's on a continuum anyway, and I think there is something about accessing psi-conducive states. But I'm not the sort of person who goes around having lots and lots of experiences in my life at all. I probably am, medium to higher, transliminal, but not really high. I have some synesthetic traits, but I don't think it's the cool type. It's time-space, which is interesting. But no, I think it's about the state. I think it is about the state.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Anyone else?
Thank you so much. This is more of a comment and kind of a reflection, both from yesterday and today. I'm thinking about the mediums that I've interviewed and that I worked with, and one of the quotes, if that's okay to pull up, really kind of, brings into practice what you're talking about the use of fractals. And one of my participants, and I've experienced this myself as well, both in readings and my own mediumship, she said, she talks about how she's sitting in the power, and she says, I'll go into meditation and I call my loved one in. I get a full vision of his body. I know in the past he's given me almost zoomed in experiences where you see every single freckle, every feature on his face. It's almost like I'm getting a detailed full body scan, and it helps me remember exactly what he looks like. And we feel this, I know I've experienced it in mediumship as well, of like I'll receive a document and then they'll zoom into the words. And so there's an application here, I think it's really meaningful to understand our experiences when we get them mediumistically, to really understand, I guess, kind of how to interpret them, and then overlay them on a framework that helps us to just kind of, I don't believe them, trust them, but also understand kind of the breakdown of what they mean. So just thought that was interesting and overlap.
That is interesting, and just your description of what that's like sounds quite fractal-like, like just zooming in onto...
It literally feels like you're zooming into whatever it is that you're perceiving.
Yeah,
and
thank
it is
you.
the clairvoyant. Yeah,
it's really interesting.
I'm just wondering if you have some kind of experience with the kaleidoscope, because this rings a bell of some meditation that used kaleidoscope to change states of consciousness and then enter in meditations.
So it's a particular meditative style?
Yes, and I've just pulled that there has been some research at Bond University in Australia that has been doing something that might be similar. I don't know what would be the difference between kaleidoscope approach and fractal approach.
I mean, they're probably very similar, because what this is doing is it's putting you into an interesting state, and meditation does have apparently fractal signatures associated with it. So I'm sure that there's some similarity there. I'd like to look at that particular meditation and see. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.